Just a quick story to start. I used to live in Chicago, and so like many people in this room, I was very deeply involved in the '08 Obama campaign. And in August of that year, my 3-year-old daughter and I were outside, and it was windy, and she stood up in her little tiny voice and yelled, "Wind, stop ruining my picnic." And I said, "Oh, honey, you know, we're not in charge of the wind. You know who's in charge of the wind." And she looked at me and said, "Barack Obama?" I'm like, "Oh, I've done a good job." Okay, so cute, but no, not quite. God, you know, God's in charge of the wind. And she hesitated a moment and then said, "So what is Barack Obama in charge of then?" So you can see that we were, in my whole household, clearly all in 2008. But now I fast forward 10 years, and I find myself completely frustrated by what's happening in Washington, D.C., and I know if I still lived in Chicago, I'd be completely frustrated by what happens in Springfield. I call myself politically homeless at this point, and I have had to, through force of evidence, grudgingly give up believing that even the best candidates will, in our current system, be able to go to Washington, D.C. and actually fully address our country's most critical problems. So last September, it's the green button I'm in charge of here. Is it going to start? Yeah, thank you. Last September, I published a report with Michael Porter of Harvard Business School called "Why Competition in the Politics Industry is Failing America, a Strategy to Reinvigorate Our Democracy." And I'm just going to give you a mini overview this morning. This is a new way of looking at what our challenge is as a country, and it applies to committed partisans equally as much as those who call ourselves, as I do now, politically homeless. So how many times have we all heard or said Washington is broken? As my good friend, Congressman Mickey Edwards, originally explained to me, this idea represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. Because in fact, Washington is working exactly how it's designed to work. How can our political system be so perfectly designed and yet deliver such dismal results? Well, the answer is that it's actually not designed for us. In fact, the system has been designed and fine-tuned for the benefit of private gain-seeking organizations, which are our major political parties and industry allies, which together comprise what we now call the political industrial complex. Our political problems today are not due to a single cause, but rather to a failure of the nature of the political competition that's been created. Said another way, we don't have primarily a policy problem or a politician problem. We have a political system problem. Now, our confusion is that we've been assuming that our political system has been designed to work for us, for the citizens, the voters, the public interest. But if we take a look under the proverbial hood, we see that the US political system doesn't really function how we think. And two quick examples. So if we think back to when Joe Biden became vice president and his Senate seat was open in Delaware, it was very well understood that Mike Castle, a former governor and congressman, would be the next senator from the state of Delaware. He was wildly popular. So he ran in his primary, and he lost. He lost to a Tea Party candidate in a low turnout primary. This was shocking, but really not a problem because it's just the primary. So Mike Castle can turn around and put himself forward in the general election in November, you know, as an independent. He's most popular, he would win. The problem for Mike Castle was that Delaware has a super crazy law, and it's called the sore loser law. You can Wikipedia it. And this law says that if you run in your party's primary, Democrat or Republican, and you lose, you are not allowed to have your name on the general election ballot in November, no matter what the voters in your state want. So a good question to ask is, how many states have a crazy law like this? 44. And we're in one this morning. Now, there are a few other things that we should all be aware of about partisan primaries. They're publicly funded, but they're really selection processes for partisan private organizations. And primaries are the reason why so many people show up in the general election and think, I don't love these choices that I have. Because most elections are really decided in the primary, especially in gerrymandered districts, as you guys know, and voters who turn out for partisan primaries, of which I'm always one, do tend to be more ideological than the overall electorate. And so therefore, in order to make it through the primary, candidates often have to go further to the left and further to the right than what the voters as a whole really want. But even more important, the influence of the partisan primary extends to the actual process of governing. So if we imagine ourselves as a politician, it's not just what you have to say to get elected. It's once you're elected, and you have to consider an actual solution, a bipartisan compromise. The operative question that you must ask is not, is this a good idea? It's not, is this what the majority of the country wants to see Congress do? It's not, is this what my constituents would benefit from? You have to ask, can I make it back through my partisan primary if I vote for this? And if the answer to that question is no, then the other answers never end up mattering because the rational incentive to get reelected dictates that you vote no. Now, if for some reason you do decide to vote yes anyway, but the leadership of your party doesn't like this, you can be threatened with a primary. Primary isn't just a noun anymore, it's a verb, as in, we are going to primary you. And this means, as I know you guys know, we're going to primary you with someone to your left if you're a Democrat and someone to your right if you're a Republican. It never means we're going to run a more consensus-oriented candidate to the middle. Now, let me say something really important. I am never suggesting that moderate centrist candidates are the only valuable kind of politician that we need in this country. Historically, transformational change in our country has emerged often from areas far from the center. And yet, when we try to move forward as a democratic country, eventually change must be enacted in these legislative bodies by bipartisan groups of people coming together to seek consensus. And it is in this case where we really need these bipartisan consensus-seeking moderates, and this is this particular kind of politician on both sides that our current political competition has rendered almost extinct. Currently, the combination of partisan primaries combined with partisan gerrymandering are key tools that the political duopoly uses to control the political process, and they effectively force elected officials to the right and to the left. And this makes it very difficult to govern, to actually get things done, separate from what our ideologies are. We can start to understand why so little gets done in DC. Now, a second example of our partisan system, and this is not elections, this is now governing, our two parties, the duopoly, we call them, also distort legislating by controlling the legislative machinery, which is the rules and practices of day-to-day activity in Congress. So the Hastert rule, for example, is a particularly egregious example of party control taking precedence over the legislature's ability to work collectively. The Hastert rule has become a well-accepted practice of the Speaker of the House. The Speaker will not allow a floor vote on a bill unless a majority of the majority party, which is to say the Speaker's party, supports the bill, even if the majority of the entire House would vote to pass it. So unless speakers ignore this practice, which they do from time to time, but rarely, even legislation supported by a majority of the country or a majority of the House has no chance of passing because it is never going to be brought for a vote. So if we think back to the second to last government shutdown, it's crazy, but it's the second to last one in 2013, that shutdown could have been averted if then Speaker John Boehner had allowed a floor vote on legislation passed by the Senate and supported by a majority of the House, which is to say virtually all the Democrats and a minority of Republicans. And the shutdown finally ended only when the speaker broke with his party and broke the Hastert rule to allow the vote. Effectively, this made-up rule cements majority party control in a Congress that is supposed to represent all US citizens. And it allowed a small number of extreme partisans to hold the country hostage for 16 days in a shutdown. So think about it. In your organizations, if you wanted to solve your biggest, most challenging problems, I suspect that one thing you probably wouldn't do to get started is to bring everybody together and say, hey, let's count off by twos here, divide into warring teams, but that's how it is every single day in Washington, D.C. Our founders actually warned against political parties to a person. John Adams said, "There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other." The US political system, not the government, but the political system, is not a public institution. It's a private industry, and it's a classic duopoly. So a monopoly is an industry with only one company, and the duopoly has only two. And in the duopoly, in any duopoly, the players are going to advance their own interests instead of the public interest. Now, what's unique about the politics industry as compared to almost every other industry is that there's no independent regulation. The actors in the industry are the ones that themselves make up the rules of the game. So most of us mistakenly think the rules of our political system are set in the Constitution, but that's not true for the most part. It turns out that most of the rules that govern the incentives that drive day-to-day behavior are set by the political industrial complex and for their benefit. As is always the case in life, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played and affect the outcome of the game. And the net result of the rules of the game in the politics industry is unhealthy competition, and the net result of unhealthy competition is that consumers do not get what they want. And that's what's happening in our country. Therefore, the actors in the political system are thriving. Go to Washington, D.C., it's clear. At the same time as the American public has never been more dissatisfied. This shows that currently almost 2/3 of Americans think that a major new party is needed. In any other industry this big, with this much customer dissatisfaction and only two players, some entrepreneur would see it as a phenomenal business opportunity, and we would see a new competitor responding to what customers want. But that doesn't happen in politics because the parties work very well together over decades in one particular way, and that's to rig the rules of the game behind the scenes in order to protect themselves from new competition. They erect huge barriers to entry. Put another way, politics isn't broken, it's fixed. And when researchers at Princeton and Northwestern examined congressional action on over 1,500 policy issues, they found that when the preference, and I quote, when the preferences of economic elites and organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. And troublingly, there's no accountability for that. And there's no accountability because the customer only has two choices. The duopoly doesn't actually have to deliver results in order for us to keep voting for them. Because no matter how disappointed we are, you still likely prefer what your side says they're for than what the other side says they're for. So where do we go from here? We need to rewrite the rules. The theory of change, let's summarize it. In any game, as I said, board games, sports games, serious games like politics, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played. You can change the rules of basketball and get a faster or slower game. You can incent players to take shots from different areas of the court by instituting a three-point line. And you can change the rules of the game in any industry and get different behavior. Because remember, as we said, most of the rules aren't in the Constitution, they're made up. But they've been made up to serve partisans, not to solve problems. So in order to transform the system, we have to re-engineer the rules of the game to incent healthy competition on dimensions that serve the public interest. It's both that simple and that hard. What we need is a comprehensive reform strategy. Every reform in our strategy is at the intersection of powerful and achievable. Powerful means it addresses root cause. Achievable means we can count results in years, not decades. And if a reform is not in that, we're not recommending it. It is both, sorry, I got confused. But I should note, as I'm sure you are all well aware in this room, there are no reforms at the intersection of powerful, achievable, and easy. Our strategy focuses in 4 areas, but today I'm going to talk quickly about 2. First, we have to re-engineer the election machinery. By election machinery, I mean the rules of the game for elections. If we put these reforms together in a package, they will fundamentally change what politicians are incented to do. They're going to change what candidates say to get elected, what officials do while legislating, and change the ability of voters to hold those elected officials accountable for acting in the interests of those voters. These reforms will shift power from special interest money to voters and incent action, not gridlock. Election machinery reform number 1 is that we have to eliminate today's partisan primaries where you vote only in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. Instead, when you go to the primary, there's only one ballot. Every candidate, no matter their party, and including third parties and independents running in this primary, appears on that single ballot. So you don't vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, you vote in a non-partisan primary. And the top 4 vote getters out of that primary advance to the general election. The second reform is to implement ranked choice voting in the general election. There are several critical problems with our existing elections, but here are 2. Currently, candidates can win with only a plurality. So whenever you have multi-candidate races, you see this problem. For example, a candidate could win with 34% in a 3-way race, which means that 66% of the voters preferred somebody else. Second, there's a spoiler argument. Spoiler argument inhibits healthy competition, because often we don't vote for the candidate we really want out of fear that our vote will inadvertently result in the election of the candidate that we like the least. Ranked choice voting eliminates these problems and ensures we always elect the candidate with the broadest appeal to the greatest number of voters, and here's how it works. The top 4 vote getters from that primary are on the ballot. On election day, I show up, and just like always, I vote for my favorite. But then if I want, I can also say, this is my second choice, my third choice, and my fourth choice. I can rank as many or as few as I want. And the first place votes are counted. And if someone gets a true majority, over 50%, the election is over and that candidate wins. If the leaders fall short of 50%, technology enables instant runoff voting. The last place candidate is automatically eliminated, and those voters' second choices are distributed to the candidates that are still in the race. The votes are counted again, and if there is still no candidate with a majority, then the process continues. It's basically a series of runoffs, but you don't have to keep coming back for another election. So together, these 2 reforms will powerfully change the incentives that our representatives answer to. These are not crazy new ideas, by the way. In 2002, Illinois Senate Bill 1789 proposed ranked choice voting for statewide and congressional primaries. The sponsor, then Illinois State Senator Barack Obama. And John McCain recorded a robocall supporting ranked choice voting in Alaska, so you can be a passionate, committed Democrat and be for these reforms. And others can be passionate, committed Republicans and be for these reforms. In fact, we just launched the earliest conversations on election reform in Wisconsin, and we have a completely bipartisan leadership group. Believe me, they do not agree on who they're voting for, but they do agree that we need to change the rules of the game. I'll let you read about the rest of the reforms in our report, but I'd like to close with a quote. Thomas Jefferson is reported to have said, "In America, we don't have government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate." And historically, for most of us, that's meant we need to participate by voting, or for the most engaged, like those in this room, by actively supporting candidates and policies. But it turns out that it also means that we must participate not just in elections, but in the design of the rules of the game by which we play. So if you care about candidates, if you care about policy, let's work together to get a system that does justice to the promise of this great American experiment. And I hope you will add nonpartisan election reform to the issues about which you care most passionately to get us where we want to be in our country. Thank you so much.